open. All right, so hey everyone, I'm John Paz, Senior Content Design, and today I want to give you a preview of my Button 2021 talk called Spar Your Content Like a Boxer. All right, so first, some housekeeping. Here's what I intend to cover during the session today. If there's time at the end, we'll try to sneak in some Q&A. So let's jump right into it. I don't doubt that I can get through this content pretty quickly, but I talk pretty fast already by design, and I don't want your heads to explode. So I'll try to pace myself. So you can think of this talk tonight as a preview of the longer form session of this talk that I'll be doing for Button 2021, which is the second ever Button conference, the only conference just for content designers and our mistitled brothers and sisters as well. I had the privilege of being one of the keynote speakers at last year's inaugural conference, and it was a blast. Cool thing to note, keynote presentations are only 20 minutes long, yay. But most other talks are 45 minutes long. Oh yeah, and guess when I learned that? When I started working on this presentation. The end talk at Button, which is in October 20th, will be about 45 minutes long. It will probably also involve a hands-on component. This talk was very conveniently scheduled for me, and Deborah invited me to present on whatever I wanted. And so giving a preview of this talk was beneficial to me because it helps me practice. Doing it live is always much better than doing it in a mirror. Without further ado, you'll be kind to me that as I iron out some wrinkles, I may misstep or misspeak a bit and may have to rewind a bit, but it should all be good. This is content I've been thinking about for a long time. All right, so keeping in line with the boxing theme, rather than have a stuffy old introduction section, I want to go with the customary tail of the tape format to introduce myself and the inspiration for this presentation that's themed around the sweet science. So let's dig in. I thought about trying to add a boxing joke right about here, but I couldn't think of a punchline. Hey-o, these are the jokes. All right, so I spent my entire career as a technical writer and content designer pursuing feedback from my peers. Initially, this was a defense mechanism for my imposter syndrome because I needed that validation from my peers to reassure myself. Later in my career, I began to work more closely with UX designers where I'd get invited to provide feedback on early designs or to help with naming new features or parts of a product. But it wasn't until I started working for Atlassian that the term sparring became part of my professional lexicon. After having a different meaning to me in a very personal context, which is boxing. More on that in a moment. I remember my first sparring sessions on the Stash team fondly. My first ever sparring session was during my first week at Atlassian, and Stash was the only product of Atlassian's that I had absolutely no experience working with. Our team's UX designer invited me in to the sparring session, even though I had no idea what was going on. There was just a big giant whiteboard in the closest common area where I'd seen him working for most of the morning. But what was exciting to me is that there's a visual representation of the work on the board. And this is transparency in motion. This is what Atlassian's values are all about. The details of what we sparred are kind of lost to me, but the outcomes for most of the sessions are probably lost to me as well, but the feelings that I got from sparring and the way I learned how to work with my colleagues was unforgettable because it was exhilarating. In attendance during some of my first sparring sessions from the Stash team was a designer, another writer and myself, 3 engineers, and a product manager, and an engineering lead, some very high stakes meeting attendees. I did doing some quick maths, so you can tell that this is a very expensive meeting. Even though I'd never done it before, it seemed like it must probably be important then. And what I didn't know was that the people who were in attendance during that first round of sparring sessions over a specific feature, a couple of different iterations of this sparring session, was some of the spiciest sparring that I probably ever did at my Atlassian tenure. And that's because of the people involved. There were people who were I would call them confrontational, but very direct and don't usually hide their feelings. But that showed me right off the bat that there was no pulling punches. Pun, because this was important work and we wanted to get it right. But I realized that my new guy hat was actually a superpower because I was unburdened with biases. Then there was no apprehension for me to kind of ask the basic, quote unquote, stupid questions. And so throughout these sparring sessions, I helped uncover things that teams might not have considered beforehand, or to at least ask basic questions, and teams could reiterate and refine the goals, the approaches of things that they did. So it was one of my favorite things to do was sparring work, and it's probably the thing that I take with me every day in my work post Atlassian. So working at Atlassian for 6 years, I can seriously say that I went through about hundreds of sparring sessions and hosted a great deal myself. Design sparring is one of the most effective ways to build rapport with your team, and it's a tried and true way to assist in making complex decisions. All right, so let's get to boxing just for a minute. So my record as an amateur boxing is a surprising 10 wins, 9 losses, and 6 ties, approximately. I can call the statistics surprising for a few reasons. The first of which is that nobody really kept count on how many times we boxed. This is what I'm talking about, folks, is kind of backyard boxing. These are not sanctions fights. These are things that happen after school, in people's backyards, in people's front yards. You know, it's sometimes really late at night while over video games, whatever. But these are where my fights were exclusively backyard boxing matches amongst friends and teammates of my football team in high school. The bulk of these fights probably took place before we graduated from high school, and almost all of us before we turned 30. And just for some context, I'm 37 now. Right. So let's get to the old man. This love for boxing stemmed from my dad, who was a legit amateur boxer for a handful of fights back in the 70s. Now, both my mom and my dad's family followed boxing, so growing up, we'd pass the time thinking about important boxing matches, watching highlights of classic boxing matches all the time. It was never the main focus, but we all loved it, and it's something it's always been around. Now, this next montage is intended to add to my boxing credibility by proxy via my old man. The desire to box, for me, never legitimately materialized, and mostly because of some anecdotes from the old man himself. Quote, "The problem with boxing is that when the fight is over, even if you win, you feel like you lost." So I stuck to other sports as my primary thing during high school and throughout my life, but the allure of boxing was never far from my sight. So my friends and I started an underground after-school, probably illegal background boxing club to satisfy my fascination for the sweet science. With my first ever full paycheck from my first ever part-time job as a 16-year-old, I bought a used set of 4 pairs of one-size-fits-all 16-ounce boxing gloves, and eventually we got some sparring headgear from eBay. I'm pretty sure this was my first ever online purchase, because before this moment, I literally did not have any money that did not come directly from my family members, mostly my parents, or from birthday gifts from my grandparents. One summer I asked my parents for gym equipment and a heavy bag, and this was something that I love to do as my pastime. And you see here, the end of the scrolling that you see here is me trying to tally my backyard boxing record specifically for this conversation. I mean, at the end there, you see Sandra Rivas Cole. Miss Rivas was actually my art teacher, and she's friends with me on Facebook now. And it was quite the fun conversation with her. She's actually now the teacher of my middle daughter. But fear not, dear audience, my attempt to undermine my own authority is concluded. Let me reassure you that this article was well researched, and its analogies and metaphors are rock solid. But just remember that the essence of this conversation is to help create some interesting imagery about sparring important work. So I'm not way off target. All right, so what is design sparring exactly? If any Google search of the term inevitably is going to pop up with 4 or 5 different articles written by somebody who is or used to be an Atlassian. Now, Atlassian did not invent the term or the practice design sparring, but they definitely sure have evangelized it. How you use sparring can vary from company to company or even from team to team. But there's one thing that, there's a handful of things that make design sparring really important. You can think about it almost like a design critique, like how artists do or art critics do about a specific piece of artwork. In the art world, it's not that unusual, actually. Yeah, so a quick definition, it's a design thinking exercise used a lot in UX design circles. It's a way to get feedback, criticism, advice, or some perspectives from your colleagues in a structured and safe way. What do you use it for? Well, it's well tested and a lot. Yeah, I'm stealing my own thunder. Sparring complex workflows, iterations of designs or design options for a solution. Hold on, let's back up for one moment here. Yeah, I set my script before I got there. All right, so. But the sparring can also add a lot of value to how you do your work as a content designer or technical writer. It's just design critiquing, but with rules and some consideration for your subject. The goal is not to tear down your colleague, not to tear down their work, is to advance the project forward, to help make a decision, is to help bridge the divide left by shallow or incomplete requirements and foster some empathy for your work challenges with your peers. Back to boxing for a moment. All right, so the term sparring in boxing is pretty common, and it's actually something that I was pretty familiar with. But depending on the boxer, a trainer can tailor a sparring sessions to help them achieve their goals. And sparring is actually probably one of the most frequent methods of preparation for any boxer for any fight. And to the untrained eye, a sparring session might seem like any regular boxing content you see on TV, a boxing contest you see on TV. But a boxer's trainers pick their sparring partners carefully, depending on a few factors, like who their next opponent is, or if the boxer wants to improve a specific aspect of their game, like speed or punching power, maybe defense. But furthermore, each sparring session is usually tailored to the specific goals or desired outcomes. In nearly all sparring sessions, there's usually one constant, and that's the goal of sparring is to be constructive, not destructive. And this idea translates beautifully to design critiques as well, where the principle should be the same, always and without exception. Now, the Oxford Dictionary's definition of sparring, to me, seems almost poetic. And now the emphasis here is my own, but it was Fran Sans of myboxingcoach.com who pointed out to me that this important bit of that definition of the word sparring. I've just found it fitting that it also applies to design critiques. A boxing sparring session looks a lot like an actual competition. I mean, they are throwing punches after all, but it's the intent behind the exercise that's the difference. The reasoning is sound and similar for why being destructive should be avoided. I'll turn again to my guy Franz to explain it, and I'll summarize for him. But the greatest responsibility of the trainer, and in turn the sparring session, is to ensure the well-being of the boxer. If a trainer subjects his boxer to all-out boxing matches on a regular basis as training, it exposes the boxer to a greater risk of injury, especially head injury. He goes on to explain that it's also just generally counterproductive to a boxer's growth from a psychological perspective as well. The stakes are always higher in a real, actual competitive fight, and so a fighter knows they could be hurt. If the same was true for sparring sessions, a boxer will become reluctant to try new skills, limiting their growth. Now, something else that translates well from boxing to design sparring is the idea that there are different types of sparring sessions a trainer can use to achieve different outcomes. Now, they are technical sparring, conditioned sparring, and open sparring, and I'll jump into each just momentarily. The types of sparring sessions are listed in order of increasing difficulty, skill, and risk. It's a system designed to prepare boxers for the real world of an actual boxing contest. This is like an incremental stress test with some very high stakes. A good trainer won't progress a boxer to the next phase of sparring without successfully completing the prior phase of sparring. First, technical sparring is where the boxers are wearing their protective headgear and their mouth guards, but this is an exclusively non-contact activity, effectively boxing drills with the assistance of a partner. There are no rounds. The activities and even the boxer's movements are measured and specific. Each technical sparring session starts by introducing a particular technique or sequence of skills through demonstration. Then each boxer takes a turn practicing the movements on one another in half speed, and half the speed they normally use, which is quite slow. The trainer iterates on this technique, and subsequently activities are sped up to about 75% and maybe even normal speed, still without contact, and sessions are kept short to avoid monotony. Now, conditioned sparring, boxers are going to will probably wear more protective headgear, but probably it's targeted towards areas that they might be working. Like, for instance, body punches, you might wear some body gear, and head punches, you're definitely be wearing headgear. But these activities are carried out more like rounds. However, in these sessions, the boxers are sparring one another, but with conditions or restrictions prescribed by the trainer. A session will begin with the trainer explaining the conditions, and the boxers need to adjust their techniques to account for this. For example, one boxer might only be able to throw a punch with one hand, his left or his right, or a boxer may not be able to throw, or may not be able to throw any punches at all, so she might have to dodge through the entire round, just working on her defense, her footwork, and her speed or elusiveness. But this forces a boxer to work on parts of the game that have nothing to do with other, but it is under measured conditions. Usually the striking is not with the intent to knock someone out, but for learning the purposes of the exercise. Now, open sparring might look and feel a lot more like a traditional boxing match. Boxers are wearing minimal protective gear to try to simulate actual environment scenario, and they're free to use all the skills at their disposal. Trainers and boxers take care that open sparring sessions are not treated like an actual contest, however. Because in a contest, it's within a boxer's interest to subdue their opponent as quickly as possible. The quickest way possible to subdue an opponent is usually with a knockout by way of a punch to the head. And there's a shared understanding that the intent is to become a better boxer, not to subdue your sparring partner. And there's some other variables a trainer can change to help a boxer improve, like the sparring partner selected to prepare for a specific contest. Take, for instance, if a boxer's next opponent has a particularly long reach, a trainer might look for a taller sparring partner to help for their boxer to help prepare for the challenges they'll face. You should take that lesson with you as well about design sparring, that who you invite to your design sparring should match about the outcomes that you're looking for. If you're looking for assistance devising technical solutions, it might make sense to invite more engineers than designers to a sparring session. If you're looking to walk through a workflow and a workflow for an audience that does not include developers, it might make less sense to invite more developers than designers, as they might not be the best subject matter experts on that topic. It's just an example about your audience in your sparring sessions is really important. Now, thanks for sitting through my boxing talk. It's all supposed to help reinforce some key concepts in sparring your content. Now let's get to some advice about how to use design sparring to improve your work in progress content projects. Now, before you do a single bit of actual preparation, you need to make some key determinations. First, ask yourself, what stage is my project in? What type of feedback do I need? The stage that your project is in is going to largely dictate what kind of feedback you'll be seeking during sparring. Do you want to share two different information architecture approaches you're considering? Or is there one screen in the entire flow that's being worked on and the rest is out of scope? The goal is to make sure that you can get the feedback you need in a timely and useful way. If your project is too far along where you can't incorporate the feedback, or it's too early in your project's life cycle where the feedback might not be useful yet, that's important, and it might be time to hold off or postpone or maybe cancel a sparring session. They're supposed to be fast and cheap. Who should be there and who might be there? What do they need to know? Sparring sessions with your immediate nuclear team might not need much context setting. You may have a recurring sparring session at a whiteboard that you don't need to erase, but you just add to for each session. Whatever works for your team is fine. Or you could decide to add your project to the agenda of the departmental sparring session. And this was a regular occurrence at Atlassian, which is kind of more of a drop-in, drop-out scenario, but could be attended by people who are completely unaware of your projects or your goals entirely. Be prepared to answer the fundamental questions up front. Most importantly, be able to answer the question, what problem is your project meant to solve? How can you graphically depict these options? How can you collect the feedback? Depending on the work you're sparring, you may need to get creative with how quickly you talk about your challenge so that your peers can effectively give their feedback. Sparring content can be challenging in that we are talking about is effectively words, which aren't always easy to differentiate between similar options. So for example, in deciding between two subtly different options for a label, instead of just explaining the two options, you might mock up and print out both of these options in the same dialogue and take them to a whiteboard for your peers to walk up and look at. You should also consider how you'll collect the feedback of your peers. This is an important consideration because you're going to want to recall this information at a later date. When you need this information and you want to recall it, it's not going to be fun to dig through a bunch of sticky notes. So make sure you have in some way that you can take those notes and then also put them into a format that's going to be digestible later. All right, so some best practices for sparring. You can call this the Atlassian way, trademarked, of sparring. It's hard to do it wrong with the right preparation. But what's the reason why this way is important to know, because it's meant to be quick, generally less than 30 minutes, and that anybody can be invited. And this is all by design. If the decision takes longer than that, it might not be one that's appropriate for sparring. Or maybe your project should be further along before you bring the challenge to sparring. With that said, there's no one way to spar your content. The only thing that absolutely must happen is you don't waste yours or everyone else's time. If the decision is important to you, that should not be much of a worry. The effort you put into communicating your project and the decision you want to help with, the effort you put into communicating your project and the decision you want help with, the better that outcome is likely to be. Something's wrong with that sentence. I have to work on that. So the general rules of sparring, according to Atlassian, you want to keep the attendee list moderate, not more than 6 people, or not more than 10 people, but 3 to 6 is probably the comfort range. You want to keep it intimate and diverse. You don't want everyone there to be people from your team, though it's a good idea to have at least one there that maybe help with context. Stakeholders and interdependent project teams are a great idea, but be sure to understand what the impact could be for them and your project. Diverse perspectives here pay dividends in uncovering your own assumptions and biases. So you get double points for inviting people who are outside of your team, but make sure they're not going to just slow things down. So you give them enough context. For booking your meeting room, I always, the rule of thumb is I book it for an hour, but 30 minutes of prep time. I get there 30 minutes ahead of my peers. And I use about 30 minutes worth of time just for the sparring session. And I'll show you what a breakdown of that time looks like in the next slide. The prep time is for you to set up your visual representation, taping things to the board, and also to prepare sticky notes and markers or whatever tools your team's going to need to give you the feedback that you need. The visual representation of your work is a really important bit, but I don't want you to get distracted or bogged down trying to make it. Essentially, it could just be blown up versions of the thing that you're looking at, so that whatever your view is on your computer screen is something that can translate to a whiteboard, so that people can be less distracted about the thing that's showing what you're talking about and more be able to focus on what you're talking about. You also do yourself a world of good by establishing some ground rules early. Giving you an example of some ground rules that you can use here, and towards the end, I'll be actually when the button presentation comes out, I'll also be publishing a blog post with some templates and things that you can download and use yourself. But don't lose sight of the fact that you are the moderator of the session. You are in control. So it's up to you to ensure the amount of time and attention you give your peers is fair and equitable. Everyone should get an opportunity to share at least one big insight. That's why if you have a team that's too big, if you got 15 people, it's really hard to get one insight from everyone in this short amount of time. Lastly, don't depend on your brain to remember these details. Brains are for thinking, not for remembering. Capture that data and review it. But book times afterwards to make sure it doesn't get missed. All right, so this is an example agenda of what it might look like for a sparring session. And 30 minutes can hardly feel like enough time to dive into a complex problem, but it's enough, just barely, and that's exactly what you want. So lean on the preparation for this moment to help guide your peers through the context of your problem, and only your problem. This sometimes requires you to be explicit about what is not in scope, as well as what is in scope. And sometimes you have to interrupt people if they get on a soapbox and start to monologue a bit. Here's how a sparring session might be organized, but take care to make sure that the format of the meeting works for you and your project's goal. You want to start by setting the stage and narrowing the focus, walk through your challenges and your options, and this is where you can clearly articulate the ask. This is the thing that was hard to figure out by yourself in a vacuum that you want input on. This is where clarifying questions are expected. The next 5 minutes, the middle 5 minutes, are probably the most important 5 minutes of the entire session. This is where you have silent observation. You and your peers are having silent observation. Your peers can walk up to the whiteboard. They can view your work in detail. You'll see them scribbling on their notepads. And the entire time, my advice as a moderator myself for you is to put your hand over your mouth to make sure that you don't say anything. Not only do you not want to influence their observations or their feedback, but it's really important that people are able to finish their thoughts. You've given them 5-10 minutes worth of context for a very hard and complex problem that's completely out of their comfort zone. They need a moment to digest and to give you what you need. Be quiet. The next 15 minutes are that moment where everyone can let out their breath and finally give that one big itching piece of feedback. If someone's got more than one big piece of feedback, let's talk about it offline, or make sure you capture those ideas in a note, and I'll be sure to capture those data points. But sometimes you'll find you'll have new and interesting supporters from these sparring sessions, because it's also about advertising and evangelizing your own work. But once you've done this, the sparring session can be concluded for for the peers, for the people, for your participants. For yourself, this is the moment where you need to start taking charge of your data and finding a way to put it in a place, in a format that can be recalled later, that will make sense to you when you need to make a decision. This is an often forgotten step for the too busy content designer. You get swamped trying to clean up after your sparring session. There's markers everywhere. There's Post-its. You got to take the Post-its off. Stop what you're doing, and before you do anything, take a picture of the whiteboard. Take a picture of your working space. That moment in time is important, and you want to be able to make sure that you can recall it accurately. Because if you're like most places, the whiteboard's got people behind you that want to get into it. So you're going to have to eventually erase all your work. Take a good picture, high resolution picture of it. Take pictures of each section if you need to, so that you can recall it later. Trust that your preparation is going to bear fruit, that you conducted your sparring session according to plan. Take those pictures, grab that data, and get back to your desk. But if there's some interesting insights, some action items that fell out of this, I say stop in the hallway if you have to and write those things down. You just had a large data dump yourself, and you need to make sure that those important bits don't get lost in the shuffle. All right, I lost my point here. So make sure that you find a way that this data can be, that you understand where this data came from in the beginning. Sometimes sticky notes, people don't put their initials or anything on them. Color code these things. Again, trust in your preparation that you made a way that you can figure out what the heck all this stuff means later, because it'll look like hieroglyphics in about an hour. Lastly, you want to make sure that after this thing, you actually use the outcomes from the sparring session to inform your work. You don't have to force a square peg in a round hole. If the data suddenly becomes obsolete, the data becomes obsolete. But you do these sparring sessions, you put all this hard work in there for these outcomes to be informed by the work. So make sure you find a way to remember to do that and to use these data points in your decision-making sessions, and to use them to justify decisions and arguments with other people who might disagree with your approaches on things. I say arguments is less confrontational, it could be conversations. And even though these sparring sessions aren't magic, they can help you make these decisions and at least make them with more confidence of your opinion. Even if it gets overwritten, you at least know that you did the hard work and you stand firm by your answer. These are the things that you need to do your job great, not just good. But managing your expectations and understanding this stuff is not magic, but that the more work you put into it, the more stuff you're going to get out of it. And schedule more sparring sessions. This is a muscle that needs to be worked out. You don't want your team's sparring muscle to be atrophied. And if you don't have something specific to spar, it could be just a moment where you take 5 or 10 minutes and catch up on something, so that you keep that system going. Rounding out to the end here. There's a time already. I don't even know how much time it's taken. Let me see. 27 minutes. Perfect. All right, so some conclusions, just some last minute pieces of advice. Set up your sparring sessions thoughtfully. Even if you don't use these things that I prescribed in this presentation, you don't use the Atlassian way, treat it like a legit design exercise. Even if it's only a session for a few people, you'll be surprised at how well the outcome can be just by having to formulate your thoughts in an organized way. Ritualize your sessions to help improve your team's sparring muscles. Stole my own thunder again. Don't let your muscles atrophy. Your design sparring muscles atrophy, especially for you content people, us content people, because when you decide that you're going to start sparring content, people are going to look at you like you're funny, and it's something that most content designers, technical writers get away with not doing. But I promise you, it will increase the value of your work, and it will start to show people that you're not just sitting behind a desk clicking buttons all the time, that you're actually doing things, making hard decisions, and you can kind of give them a demonstration of that with really thoughtfully, well laid out design sparring sessions. But choose your sparring partners wisely. You want a difference of opinion. You want diversity of thought, of discipline, of perspective. What you don't want is disinterested trolls. If you find someone who's not adding stuff to sparring, stop inviting them. That's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you all so much for sitting through this. I hope it made sense. I hope that you got something out of it. And if nothing else, I hope that it made you laugh. Thanks a lot. Here's some works cited stuff that you're probably not going to have time to read, but I'm going to blow past that to my end screen anyway. Thanks a lot, y'all.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Now, if we want to open up for questions, you can either ask questions out loud or throw it in the chat and we can bring it up.
I know there's going to be at least one trolling question from my family. Rope-a-dope, there it is.
Not necessarily a question, but when you were talking about the part of the session where you should listen, it reminded me of Ali against Foreman, when Ali just took the punches. He didn't punch back, and it was kind of like a metaphor for Ali absorbing it all, and that's what you were trying to get at with listening. So I just wanted to share that that insight that you generated in me.
I love it. I love it. Thank you.
Mhm. Christine is asking, do you have any tips for conducting this remotely?
Ooh, that's a great question, Christine. Thank you. I'm going to actually add something into my next version of this for that specifically, because that Atlassian design sparring, when I started, was largely an in-person exercise, and that was 2015. By 2018-19, I was already trying to work remotely from home as much as possible, but I didn't want to not participate in sparring. Luckily, this was a common challenge amongst our designers. So if you do a Google search for designing Atlassian or Atlassian/sparring or any combination of Atlassian design sparring, there's a couple of, there's one written by MCC, Marie Claire, who talks about the process that we used for doing remote sparring, and it kind of involves using a template to kind of that allows you, what I just explained here about how you'll set some context, then you'll ask for some feedback, and then you'll get a chance to respond to that feedback. They essentially have created a Confluence page template to do that, so that you kind of can do it either asynchronously. You can drop by and leave comments on the mock-ups. So, for example, you have a page at the top will have a context, might link to a Jira ticket or link to some specs or requirements. Then underneath it will be the mock-up or the challenge that you pose, and then beneath that you may leave some space for people to leave comments or for important things to note. And then depending on what mechanism you're using, obviously Confluence is great for this. It's literally designed for this kind of collaboration. You can do it asynchronously, but we would do, so that's one way to do it remotely, is completely asynchronous. You kind of it works great for people who have mismatched time zones with their colleagues. But another way is, we had the regular design sparring session every Wednesday or whatever, and people would be working from home or would be in another location. They'd want to chime in to design sparring, and so we'd have this page every week that was kind of, I just had a date on a table, and for every date we had three slots, 15 minutes for each slot. And you could sign up for a slot and basically jump in, same thing, link to a page. It's a very similar template, but you read it kind of in real time. You go over the context, you provide some screenshots, and you say, and I'm opening up for feedback. And people who work remote will add some feedback. We used a couple different tools for this. One was Mural. Mural is fantastic for on-the-fly design sparring. Envision kind of can do this for kind of those prototypes. And other kind of tools, like I think Figma can do it now as well. But you do those things in real time. It's kind of the same process, but you do it in real time, and you get a little bit of time for back and forth before the next presenter needs to go and spar their work. That was some of my favorite stuff to do, because you get to look at projects that you'd never ever get a chance to work on, and people at Atlassian were always working on really cool stuff. So that was a lot of fun for me. But thanks for the question, Christine.
Cool. Sabina is asking, what are the best what types of content have you found to be great candidates for sparring sessions, and which are best for a different type of review/process?
Oh, I love this. I feel like I added teasers that you guys are finding all over the place, because one of the things I added that I didn't get time to for this iteration of the talk, but I figured would be useful for the final version, is to go over specific examples of work that I've sparred, and then also to kind of spar some work during my presentation, which is I'm going to try to pull off in October. So it's kind of short answer, longer. big time decision on naming convention. So a lot of times in project kickoffs, they guys say, we're making the brand new widget, and the widget is the name of the thing. How you use the widget, how the things that connect to the widget, the menus inside the widget, all those things, nobody names those things. It's now the designer's job to name those things, and they hate having to name things that they don't really want to mess with. So you're writing your documentation and say, widget 1 connects to widget 2. He's like, why do we keep calling everything widget 1 and widget 2? It's like, oh, I didn't feel like naming anything. So you're like, this is a terrible naming convention though. Like, why do we do this? It's like, it is what it is. I don't care. Then you name it what you want. And then you name it what you want, and you provide some feedback. The engineer codes it in, and then in code review, they're like, the designer goes, I didn't name it that. That's not the name I gave. It's like, but my name's better. Like, I don't think it's better. Are you sure? Because you said you didn't care, and now I cared, and I think that name's better. Now we have a conflict of interest, or we just have a kind of inherent conflict. Widget 1 versus the thing that connects to widget 1 is the two naming conventions I'm gonna show to somebody. If I just go to Deborah right now and say, Deborah, which name is better, widget 1 or thing that connects to widget 1? Right? Mine's better, right? Like Deborah's got no context of what I'm talking about. Deborah works in another company, but she humors me all the time. So to kind of validate my decision, or at least to try to help understand where I'm wrong, I'll show Deborah just a bit of context. Say, we make widgets. We don't talk about it now as privileged information. Don't trade any of the stock on this information. But we didn't name this thing when they gave me the requirements, and I think my name's better. Actually, I won't even sway you like that, Deborah. Just which name is better given the context that I just given you. And in the sparring session, Deborah gives me a bunch of feedback. And Deborah's a bigwig. She's really important. Her opinion matters. So when I'm making a decision and I would decide whether I want to dig my heels in and kind of be a stickler, like, no, this is the hill I'm going to die on. This thing cannot be named widget 1 because we got something else called widget A, and that's just confusing. We can't have widgets 1 and A all over the place. It's ridiculous. But Deborah came in and says, no, I like the consistency. Widgets are widgets everywhere. I'm not, why you add more words to that? Cut that out. And so now I have a decision. I have something to go on that's outside of my team. That's another data point for me to make a call on. So nomenclature is a big one. Another type of thing that you might want to spar on is different approaches. If you're going to be changing your information architecture, I thought we saw Andrew online at one point. Oh, he jumped off early. Tried to call him out early. But information architecture is a huge one because it's you don't always get to do proper user testing and go out and ask your users if this thing is right. So you may decide to test 2 different approaches to how you lay out the information, and you may not have a strong opinion either way. Like, these are just 2 different approaches, depends on what our goals are. And so you may pull in business leaders, CEOs, design executives, whatever, and say, these are the 2 choices that I have to make. And their time is really valuable. So you don't want to spend more than 30 minutes, they can afford to give you that. That's their coffee break, essentially. You set the context up, you give them the 2 options, you say, which one's better? And then when they make a decision, you say, why do you think that? And then you get some reasoning from them. They might just say, I don't know, this one just kind of feels better. Or they may say, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think this one is better. This approach is going to be better. And you didn't even realize there's a CEO who cares about information architecture. So there's just, it all depends. Anything can be sparred and everything can be sparred. But I always find the things I want to spar are the things that are problems that frustrate me, or that I come back to, or that I just didn't get right the first time around, and I want someone else to help with.
Cool.
These are fantastic questions. Deborah, please send me a transcript of these questions because I'm going to use them to make my presentation better.
Yeah.
We'll
And
put them
Swapna's asking, do you have any tips for extremely small teams without knocking out potential partners? Hee.
Small teams without knocking out, that is tricky. This is where maybe less ritualization might be useful. If you just find a way to have these conversations, if you find yourself always at the water cooler, at the coffee pot when COVID wasn't a thing, and you say, he's like, hey, remember that problem you talked about yesterday? I did another iteration on it. What about this? So maybe keeping it informal. I wouldn't say try to be deceptive about it. Tell the people, like, I like when you give me input on these things, and even if it's just, even if it's outside of your realm, you think that we could, I could bring you a problem once or twice, or I promise I won't use up a lot of your time. As long as you're being mindful and respectful of their time, it's something that they either have a stake in, are interested in, or care about. I don't think it should be any different on a smaller team than with a big team. If anything, it gives you more time to discuss your feedback or provide more feedback, because there's less voices that you have to hear. I say I hadn't thought about the consideration, but I think it works just as well for small teams. Actually, may work better for small teams than it does for big teams. Great question, though. I think there's one question. Sakura, did we get to? I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. I don't think we got to that question, did we?
They were pretty similar to Sabina's. Just some examples of content designs, things you've solved through sparring. I'm not sure if you have any more to say about that.
Yeah. So the specific. So I left the product team. My last time working for a product team at Atlassian was 2019. So the details of some of these projects escape me. But I know that I was, again, writers usually spar, for every one of my sparring sessions, there'd be 10 design sparring sessions with a UX designer leading them. I was much more of a participant in design sparring than a moderator. That's just by the nature of the work. But the things that I liked to spar were the things that were small, that nobody cared about but me and maybe one other person, to solve arguments and stuff like that. And a good example is the word please in UI. And I put this open challenge to you word nerds here. There is never an appropriate time to use the word please in the UI, ever. I mean, I was at one point, I created memes on this. Look, I love this. I see thumbs up everywhere. You are all my people. My tribe is here. I found you all because when I got challenged on this, and someone said, I still don't think it's that big of a deal. What I did was I held up I literally went I know how to do search in the UI. I would search for every instance of the word please and see which screen they are. I went and took screenshots of all the screens that had the word please in them and lined them all up on one side of the screen, on one side of the whiteboard. I literally print them. I called myself the tree slayer because I would print out all these screenshots and post them on the whiteboard. And on the other side of the whiteboard, I would remove the word please and just put right next to them. And the sparring session started with, I literally started the sparring session with, which is better? Do we need please ever? And they looked at me and they thought it was a joke. And it was, it was definitely in jest. I was definitely being a little trolly here, but I made my point. And I didn't have to do that ever again. And at some point, it was very early in my Atlassian tenure, and I gained a reputation for being a stickler for my rules. Like if I went to the time to make up like a thoughtful mnemonic device or for some way to not screw up the UI copy, you should do well to remember it, or I'm going to start taking screenshots and post it on Twitter.
Cool. We've got about 5 minutes left. Thanks so much, John, for the great presentation. If you guys want to ask John any more questions offline, I think, do you have your contact information? Probably in the invite.
Maybe at SR Content Design is my handle on almost all social media things. I say find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter, probably not Instagram. I don't usually check Instagram, but find me anywhere you want to talk about any of this stuff, or you just want to connect. I'm open to connecting to anyone and everyone. I say reach out, get in touch. I don't